Hi everybody. Today I'm going to talk about how the Swedish model for handling sex work contributes or even incites violence against sex workers. In one of my previous videos about the murder of Eva-Marie, also known as Jasmine, I mentioned that this Swedish model is vastly superior to this American model, but that being less awful than something completely awful just isn't good enough. Let's start with what these models means. We can take three basic models here. The American, the Swedish and the New Zealand model. There's also the German model, but I'm not going to bother to go into the distinction between the New Zealand model and the German model. It's a bit off topic today. The basic thing here, the American model criminalizes the sex workers. It may or may not also criminalize the clients. It varies from state to state, but the basic thing is that the sex worker is considered a criminal for selling sexual services. The Swedish model goes the other way around. It criminalizes the client, not the sex worker. At least in theory. I will return to that shortly. The New Zealand model is decriminalization. You don't count it as a crime. In itself, of course. I mean, sexual harassment is still forbidden, rape is still forbidden, kidnapping is still forbidden, and so on. And I mention this just because people tend to bring up trafficking and that kinds of thing. But of course that's illegal. Come on. That's not what we're talking about here. The American model is extremely problematic. We're talking about a victimless crime here. The idea that the sexual act would be criminal in itself, that is rather absurd and archaic. It's a theocratic rule, not a democratic one, and it makes no sense whatsoever, really. But it leaves society with the impression that sex workers will be some kind of filthy subhumans. It's dehumanizing, it's not really human. I mean, if a person has done a crime against another person, then it seems reasonable to punish the offender. But victimless crimes? Not good. The Swedish model, like I said, it goes the other way around. It criminalizes the client. And the argument here is that it isn't a victimless crime. It is the sex worker who is the victim. Thereby, we get around the victimless crime bullshit, and it's not dehumanizing in the same way. The client is seen as someone who has hurt someone and should be punished for that. And the sex worker, well, there's the problem. She's seen as a human, but not as an adult human. And when I say she, I mean female sex workers. In theory, the same law applies to male sex workers, and there are plenty of male sex workers. According to some studies, if we count the total number of sex workers, there are more male sex workers than female. However, most sex work is done by female sex workers because the males only do it a few times. and almost always with male clients, by the way. But this idea that an adult can't really choose for herself, she's brainwashed, it's self-harm, yada yada yada. I mean, if two people make an agreement and none of them is forced by extreme circumstances or a kidnapper, pimp, whatever, how do we nullify that? How do we claim that, oh, this person can't know what she's doing, she's a victim by definition? You have to infantilize this person, and this is what the Swedish model does. The Swedish model is all about saying that sex workers are not real adult humans, they are real human children and should be treated as such. Now, what's wrong with treating adults as children, you may ask, besides being condescending and unfair? Well, sadly, the Swedish model do contribute to discrimination and prejudice and bigotry, violence and murder against sex workers. This happens in 7 ways, and sadly it does have these 7 ways in common with the American model. The American model has this more strongly, but the Swedish model has it as well. First of all, the sex worker is socially constructed to be something else than the rest of us, separate from normal people. And this is exactly what people need to be able to not care. When a sex worker gets mistreated or even murdered, it's not one of us who got mistreated or murdered, it's one of them, one of the others, one of those who are not like us. So we don't have to care, and that makes it so easy. And quite frankly, I think this is a big part of the point with both the American model and the Swedish model. It helps us to not care, it helps us to accept violence against people, so it doesn't have to hurt us when it happens. Very convenient, but not okay, not humane. Second, this infantilization, it's the perfect excuse to not listen to the people involved, and that's the best way to protect prejudice and bigotry and discrimination. I've heard so many Swedish politicians and Swedish activists being active in issues about sex work or prostitution, who they like to call it, who brags about not listening to the people that they claim that they are trying to help. They brag about how they refuse to listen to what actual sex workers have to say about their own lives. I find this very malign. I find this very problematic, to say the least. It's a very bad sign. It also makes the bigotry invisible. You can just blame it on the victim. Say that, oh, but that's because she's a sex worker. And again, it's the female sex workers that we have the prejudice and discrimination and bigotry against. The male sex workers are made invisible altogether, and that is also a problem because sex work is often problematic. It varies from case to case, but there are a lot of people who do need help, who have a really bad time in that line of work and really need to get out of it. And then it doesn't help that people decide that, oh, but this doesn't count because you're male. So it's problematic in both ways. also, this system that criminalizes the client, it does affect who buys the services. It becomes a bigger percentage of people who are deranged and hateful and so on. It's the nice clients who stop buying because of the law, not the bad clients. The bad clients just keep purchasing. And of course, most of the good clients stay as well, but those clients who do quit because of the law are usually among the nicer of the clients. So it really doesn't help the work situation that way. And it also affects the sex workers' ability to choose her clients. With more secrecy, more hush-hush, more being invisible to each other, it becomes harder to choose good clients. For this reason and the previous reason, many sex workers find that they have to take larger risks in their line of work. The work becomes more dangerous. There's more risk that they end up with some total creep. It becomes harder for them to screen. And of course, there's still a lot of screening going on, but it becomes harder. So this is a big problem as well. Furthermore, we have the risk of extortion in various situations. There was one sex worker I talked with a few years ago. Local policemen had been spying on her, and they simply informed her that we know about your clients and we will prosecute them unless you give us free intercourse. Sadly, I don't think this is very uncommon. It does happen every now and then. And of course, police are not the worst offenders. There are all kinds of criminals and shady people who love taking advantage of people. So, extortion is a huge problem, and one central thing here is that Sweden have two laws regarding prostitution. One is the one that the client is considered a criminal, but the other law is even worse. It is heralded as being against pimps and traffickers, but what it actually means is that if two sex workers share an apartment or otherwise look out for each other, they are considered each other's pimps and abusers, so they are both criminals for aiding a sex worker, for helping each other. And this law can also be used against friends and family of sex workers. It can be dangerous to have sex workers close to you, or even be suspected of being close to a sex worker. And it goes without saying that this really maximizes the stigmatization. This is extremely destructive. RFSU, the Swedish branch of International Planned Parenthood Federation, wants to revise this law and also have an impartial evaluation of the previous mentioned law. I agree with the first part, with revising this law. We do need a law against pimping and trafficking, but the way it's made now, it hurts innocent people, and it severely hurts the people it pretends to be about helping. As for sexköpslagen, the law that criminalizes clients, well, I want to remove that law, but not just remove it outright. I think some parts of it need to be kept. They just need to be moved to other laws. For example, it shouldn't be okay to go around asking women how much it costs to fuck them. But this should be about sexual harassment, not about prostitution being illegal. And so on. I mean, we do need strict laws against everything that actually victimizes someone, but this victim by definition bullshit really needs to go. Personally, I believe that we have enough data already. We see how bad the law is. I think we have enough to remove it right away. But I fully understand that the big NGOs want to take it easy and one step at a time and do a big evaluation. Such an evaluation could also be good for how to move those parts of the law that I was talking about. So although I don't really agree, I do support the decision, and I actually voted for it on the Congress in spite of arguing against it at the stand. But finally, there's one more thing I need to talk about today. One more way in which the Swedish law, the Swedish model, contributes to violence and so on against sex workers. As I have already shown, the Swedish model does contribute to stigmatization and othering. And this stigmatization and othering makes it much harder to leave the industry and to stay out of it. People have this attitude of once a hooker, always a hooker. And it's not even limited to the kind of sex work that some people like to call prostitution. It's other kinds of sex work as well. I remember one case a few years ago. There was a woman who was kicked out of the university. She wasn't allowed to study anymore because there had been some naked pictures of her in some magazine. Like, yeah, I'm speechless. And another case, my mother had a co-worker when she worked in healthcare. This was a nurse or something like that who had once been a sex worker. And the other co-workers wanted to kick her out when they found out. They wanted her to go back to the street where she belonged. Like she was dirty because she had once worked as a hooker. And these are not isolated incidents, they are part of a pattern. And it's also internalized. It's hard to study at the university even if you don't think there's a risk you will be kicked out. It can still be hard to bother to study, to try to improve yourself when society is telling you that you're dirty and worthless and not a real adult, just a little wayward child who is harming herself and everything. It's really hard to break out when people push that kind of shit on you. And like I said, a lot of people in that industry really needs to get out of it. But the Swedish model doesn't help them. Instead, it traps them in the stigmatization and in the othering. And this is one of the main reasons why this model has to go. We have to take decriminalization. In Sweden, that is. And countries where it's already decriminalized, they must not pick up this destructive law. calling sex work violence or rape doesn't just cheapen real violence and rape, it's also the perfect excuse to bring back the stigmatization and othering against sex workers, to trap them in this vicious system again. But countries that are using the American model, it might be better to switch to the Swedish model and then decriminalize, to take it one step at a time, to make a point about what the problem is. It doesn't become a civilized society to make this whole thing about being, quote, dirty, unquote. It must be a matter of who is abusing who, and if it isn't abused, then society have no right to interfere. Adults have the right to run their own lives, and the rest of us can give good advice and give help to the people who want it, but people are just pushing their own storytelling on other people, making other people side characters in their own narrative, and we don't have a right to exploit people like that. Yeah, that's all I have to say for now. To all those who are still alive, live long and prosper.